Before he was 20, he was a king. Before he was 30, he was a god. Alexander the Great didn't just conquer the world, he broke the old one and forged a new one in his own image. From the rugged mountains of Greece to the monsoon-soaked plains of India, he walked across 3 continents and never lost a single battle. This isn't just history, it's the blueprint of the modern world, written in the blood of empires and the sweat of 40,000 men who followed a madman to the edge of the map. The journey began in Pella, 336 BC, where Alexander inherited more than just a throne, he inherited a grudge. After the assassination of his father, Philip II, he took command of the most lethal military machine the world had ever seen, the Macedonian phalanx. But Alexander was more than a soldier. As a student of Aristotle, he carried a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, convinced he was the second coming of Achilles. When he finally crossed the Hellespont into Asia, he threw a spear into the sand, claiming the entire continent as spear won land. Standing in his way was the Persian Empire, the superpower of the age. Led by Darius III, it possessed infinite wealth and a 1,000,000-man army. Yet Alexander had the secret weapon of the sarissa, an 18-foot pike, and the companion cavalry, the world's first true shock troops. The war began at the river Granicus, where Alexander nearly died in a riverbed, saved only by a friend's blade. It was a wake-up call that Asia would not fall easily. But the turning point came at the Battle of Issus. Though outnumbered on a narrow coastal plain, Alexander charged directly at Darius's chariot, forcing the great king to flee and leave behind his family and his dignity. To solidify his power, he then undertook the siege of Tyre, building a massive land bridge through the sea to crush an island fortress, an engineering feat that remains legendary to this day. His ambition, however, went beyond destruction. He wanted to rule. In Egypt, he was crowned pharaoh and visited the oracle of Siwa, where priests confirmed his deepest suspicion that he was the son of Zeus Ammon. His destiny was sealed at Gaugamela in 331 BC. On a wide-open plain designed for Persian chariots, Alexander used a brilliant pawn sacrifice maneuver to create a gap in the enemy line, driving a wedge of cavalry straight into the heart of the empire. That day, the Persian Empire died. Now the Lord of Asia, he pushed into the upper satrapies, the rugged terrains of modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. In this original graveyard of empires, he fought a brutal 3-year guerrilla war, eventually marrying the Bactrian princess Roxana to secure a fragile peace. By 326 BC, he reached the Indus River, facing King Porus and a terrifying new weapon, war elephants. Even in victory, the cost was too high. In the middle of a monsoon, his men reached their breaking point and mutinied. They weren't tired of him, they were tired of being legends. They simply wanted to go home. The return journey through the Gedrosian desert was a death march that claimed more lives than any battle. Alexander finally returned to Babylon in 323 BC, already planning new conquests of Arabia and Carthage. But fate had other plans. A sudden fever struck. Some say it was malaria, others whisper of poison. On June 10th, at the age of 32, the man who had conquered the known world died. When his generals asked to whom he left his empire, his final words were, "To the strongest." This story resonates today because Alexander was the first true globalist. He blended Eastern and Western cultures, creating the foundation for the Roman Empire and Western civilization. For anyone who values leadership, disruption, and the sheer power of human will, Alexander remains the ultimate protagonist, flawed, brilliant, and unstoppable. With the Persian Empire reduced to ashes, Alexander's eyes turned toward the rising sun. He believed that just beyond the mountains of the Hindu Kush lay the end of the world, the great outer ocean. In 327 BC, he led his battle-hardened army into the Punjab, entering a land of thick jungles, exotic religions, and kings who did not fear his name. The heat was unlike anything the Greeks had ever felt. The air was a heavy shroud of humidity, and the sky began to bleed an endless torrent of rain, the great monsoon. It was here, on the banks of the Hydaspes River, that Alexander faced his most disciplined opponent yet, King Porus. Unlike the Persians who fled at the first sight of a charge, Porus stood his ground with an army backed by 200 war elephants. To the Macedonians, these were not just animals, they were living mountains, gray titans that could crush a man with a single step and gore horses with tusks tipped in steel. The battle was a bloodbath. The elephants trampled the Macedonian phalanx, screaming in pain as Alexander's men used specialized axes to hamstring the beasts. Through sheer tactical genius and a daring midnight river crossing, Alexander secured the victory, but the cost was etched in the faces of his men. After the battle, instead of executing Porus, he asked him how he wished to be treated. "Like a king," Porus replied. Impressed by such defiance, he restored his lands and made him an ally. But the win was hollow. His favorite horse, Bucephalus, who had carried him from Greece to the edge of India, finally collapsed and died. The army pushed further, reaching the Hyphasis River, but the spirit of the men was broken. Rumors reached them of even greater empires to the east, empires with thousands of elephants and millions of soldiers. For the first time in 8 years and 11,000 miles, the invincible army said no. In a rain-drenched tent, the man who considered himself a god wept because his mortals would follow him no further. Alexander didn't lose to an enemy, he lost to the exhaustion of his own legends. He turned his army south, beginning a long, agonizing retreat through the Indus Valley, a journey that would lead them to the sun-scorched hell of the Gedrosian Desert. The conquest was over. The struggle to stay alive had begun.
The retreat from India was not a parade, it was a massacre. To punish his men for their mutiny, or perhaps out of a desperate need to explore the unknown, Alexander chose the most treacherous route back, the Gedrosian Desert. This was a sun-scorched hell of shifting sands and blistering salt flats where no army had ever survived. For 60 days, the world's conquerors became scavengers. Men boiled their leather saddles for food. They drank the blood of their horses to stay alive. By the time they emerged from the dust, Alexander had lost more men to the heat and thirst than in all his battles combined. He had marched into the desert a god, but he crawled out a ghost. When he finally returned to Babylon in 323 BC, the atmosphere was thick with omens. Dark birds fell from the sky, and prophets warned him that the city would be his tomb. But Alexander ignored the gods he once claimed as kin. He began planning an invasion of Arabia, then Carthage, and eventually Rome. He wanted to turn the Mediterranean into a Macedonian lake. His ambition had become a fever, burning brighter than ever, even as his body began to fail. Then, during a massive banquet in honor of a fallen friend, the invincible king collapsed. A sharp pain pierced his back as if struck by a spear. For 12 days, the empire held its breath. As the fever took hold, Alexander lost the use of his legs, then his voice. Rumors of poison rippled through the palace, whispers of a slow-acting toxin delivered in a wine cup by those who feared his growing madness. On June 10th, the gates of the palace were opened. His veteran soldiers, the men who had bled for him from the Nile to the Indus, filed past his bed in a silent, tearful procession. Alexander could only move his eyes, acknowledging his brothers in arms one last time. When his generals leaned in and asked the question that would determine the fate of the world, "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" he whispered his final, devastating decree, "To the strongest." With those words, the greatest empire the world had ever seen was set on fire. Alexander was only 32.
He had no heir old enough to lead, and his death triggered 40 years of civil war that tore his world apart. His body was encased in a golden sarcophagus and hijacked to Egypt, where he remains a legend buried under the sands of time. He left behind a world that spoke his language, worshipped his image, and lived in the shadow of his memory. He was the man who reached for the stars and for a brief, violent moment held them in his hand. Alexander was dead, but his body refused to decay. Ancient chroniclers claim that for 6 days after his passing, his skin remained fresh and his limbs supple, leading many to believe that he truly was a god. Modern scientists, however, suggest a more terrifying reality. Alexander may have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a paralyzing disorder that left him appearing dead while he was still internally conscious. The man who conquered the world may have been buried alive. But while the king lay still, the world he built began to scream. The "to the strongest" decree was a death sentence for peace. His generals, known as the Diadochi, or successors, immediately drew their swords. They didn't just fight for land, they fought for his corpse. Ptolemy, his childhood friend, hijacked Alexander's funeral carriage, diverting the golden sarcophagus to Egypt. He knew that whoever held the king's body held the divine right to rule. For the next 40 decades, the empire was a slaughterhouse. His mother, Olympias, was executed. His wife, Roxana, and his young son, Alexander IV, were poisoned in the dark of night. The bloodline of Achilles was extinguished. Out of the chaos, 3 great kingdoms emerged: the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Greece. These were the Hellenistic empires that would dominate the world until the rise of Rome. Alexander's true victory, however, wasn't found in a crown, but in a language. Everywhere he went, he built cities, over 70 of them, and most were named Alexandria. These cities became the Silicon Valleys of the ancient world. In the great library of Alexandria, the wisdom of the East and West collided. Greek became the universal language of trade, science, and philosophy. Without Alexander, the New Testament would not have been written in Greek. The statues of Buddha in India might not have taken on human forms inspired by Greek art, and the Roman Empire would have no blueprint for global dominion. Even today, 2,000 years later, the ghost of Alexander haunts our culture. Military commanders at West Point still study his tactics. Leaders still chase his greatness. He remains the ultimate symbol of human potential pushed to its absolute breaking point. He was a man who burned so bright that he blinded the world, leaving us to wonder what would have happened if he had lived to 40. He died at 32, having seen the edge of the world, only to realize that the hardest thing to conquer wasn't an empire, but himself.